all about photography competitions, and obviously it's a little bit of photo competition time of year at the moment, so we thought it was quite topical to go with that. But also, it's a very almost essential part of photography in a way, in terms of using competitions to improve your portfolio and get some very valuable peer feedback as well. And so we'll be touching on all sorts of those topics tonight. I might throw it over to Paul, as I usually do, because Paul's great at introducing a topic, and Paul's no slouch when it comes to competitions, having won a whole plethora of international competitions, as well as being a judge himself. So what do you think about competitions, Paul?
Yeah, it's pretty fresh on the brain at the moment. I was literally running late to put some entries into a competition tonight. And yesterday I was doing training for another, judging another competition. So it's, yeah, love them or hate them. They're out there and they're growing and quite a significant part of the community. And I feel like they're a wonderful way to, I guess, give yourself a push and challenge yourself a little bit to move beyond maybe we've done before, experiment. Reach out and get critique, use the time to reflect on how your work's developing. That happens for me sort of year to year, looking back. Reaching out to other people and maybe becoming part of a small pool that looks at each other's work and gives each other feedback. And it's as much as it can be a bit of a pain and sometimes it costs a bit of money, I do think it's a very valuable tool for growth. And I guess, some of the dangers is trying to look at your images thinking, what do I put in that someone else is going to like, which is pretty common when you're starting out. And if you can sort of put your ego aside to realize that it's kind of really an opportunity for a bit of feedback on your work, and also maybe getting a sense of where your work fits in the wider genre and other people operating in wherever it is at the same time. So yeah, it's been a big part of my life, and both entering and judging, and I love it. I do find the awards process a bit painful sometimes, because you can second guess yourself a bit too much, and even the amount of times I've done it, I'm still doing that. Some competitions suit your work more than others. We'll go through that a bit tonight, and we'll have a look a little bit about how you curate your work, the pitfalls, some of the competitions that we're sort of more aware of or know more about, that we'd probably recommend having a look at. Some of the things to be aware of, when you're entering, maybe a few notes about how to prepare some of your work and your files. And I'll be bouncing off the lads here to see what their thoughts. They're no slouches either when it comes to hitting pay dirt with K dirt. Nick, you got any general thoughts to set the scene?
I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with competitions. I don't enter many myself. I'm pretty selective with the ones that I do enter. They really have to suit my style of photography, and that's something that we'll talk about tonight. But I've always been torn about them, because photography in general seems very competition driven, whether it be as if you're in business, or whether it's even at the grassroots, at camera clubs. Everything seems to be about competing against other people, and so it's an interesting one. It can be obviously wonderful, and I think there are a few negatives as well. So that might be something that we can talk about during the evening.
Yeah, I'm quite curious about that side of it, Nick. I think it's very, very relevant actually to and Lukey as well. Luke's had a good run, and then he's sort of taken a back seat from it for a little while as well, and there's reasons for that. So it'd be interesting to.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably not a bad thing to start talking about, because you do come across almost anti-competition people, and then you come across people that are pro-competition in a way, or there seems to be quite a spectrum of points of view when it comes to competitions. And I guess you know, and I've been on both ends of the spectrum in some ways, and at the moment I'm probably more on the I don't like the word anti by any means, but maybe just not giving it as much of a priority in terms of what I'm doing. What do you think that is, that Paul and Nick? Like, why do you think some people, for example, would be totally against competitions, or you know, quite strong in their almost are proud about the fact that they don't enter?
I'm going to let Nick speak to that one first. So I'm
Yeah.
a bit more on the other side of the fence. So.
Yeah.
I don't know, really. It could be that they simply don't win any competitions. They've entered a few and they haven't won any, and so they've decided to take the negative tack. I'd hope that's not the case in most cases. It can be that they see the standard of competitions and the standard of the winners and the shortlisted and be completely overwhelmed. It could be the around the rules and around, you know, the post-processing and the more open nature of competitions these days, as a general rule, means that you know, you can do a lot more to your photo and still have it up for a prize or whatever. So I think some people are a bit more purist and may not be able to find a competition that suits them as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess I've had those sort of thoughts in the past, and I'm a bit different with it all now, and I don't really care either way. But I really enjoy watching the judging of competitions, particularly live judging or judging that's recorded and put on YouTube or something like that. I love hearing the thoughts of judges as things go on, and I think regardless of what you think about competitions, you will learn an awful lot by listening to what the judges have got to say about particular images. And I think that's really the biggest positive that you can get. If you're able to watch live judging, or even at your camera club, if you have a guest judge come along that talks about the images that they've been judging, it really is worthwhile, because you get a completely different perspective that you might otherwise not have seen on your own photo, and some really great ideas for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And
yeah, it's you know, it's about a little bit about being aware which competitions offer that sort of feedback, Nick, because some of them, you know, and it's quite not uncommon, you just get a number and it doesn't necessarily give you any critique. So being quite conscious of that, most of my introduction to the whole world of photography was through the AIPP, which is the Australian Institute of Professional Photography, and they're the sort of singular overriding body in Australia, and they have a very similar culture and award system in New Zealand and the NZIPP, and they have quite a similar one again in America with the WPPI, and I've sort of done the circuit and judged them all quite a few times. And they are a little bit unusual in that they are print-based awards, and there's really not many left in the world. And also they're all live judging. And if you hadn't been aware, you might even be able to access some of the older judging. In fact, you usually can for a period of time after the competitions. So there's quite a buzz to it, because it's all happening in real time. And there's a whole bunch of people over your shoulder who are there, whose prints are there, and it's random when it comes up, and there's no names, and you know, there's cameras everywhere, and there's this kind of sort of emotion and I guess showcasing to the whole thing, which I personally find really interesting. It's like people really care, because they're ending competitions with work that's really meaningful to them. They're not just doing it for a client. You know, they're putting a lot of love and personal time into it, and a lot of their heart, a lot of their vision, a lot of their courage. It's not an easy thing to put what's really close to you out to your peers to be judged, as it were, and that there's a certain vulnerability in that I feel like you should be aware of, and also honor yourself for doing. And being able to put your ego aside a little bit, which is kind of hard to do when you put your heart and soul into something, and somebody gives you a crap score, you're like, wait a minute. And it happens to all of us. So I remember putting really special image of mine into the New Zealand Awards, I think it was. And I was like, geez, this has got so much going for it. It's got so much meaning and depth and spirituality. And I put it into New Zealand Awards, and it got like a bronze at 78. And it was the lowest score I ever got in my career. And I was just like, I was a bit devoed. I was just like, what did I do wrong? You know, and there was hardly any feedback, and I was just left spinning. And I was like, but I really believe in this image. It's got so much going on. And I was just like, you know, is that the feedback that I believe in? This few people on a panel in one day that might have just had bad coffee or got out of the wrong side of bed. And, you know, there's a real human element to judging. It is subjective. I've done a lot of it. There are some consistent qualities. And so I was like, you know what, stuff it. Rather than giving up on this, I'm going to put this in the Australian Awards, which means even more to me. And I'm not going to change a damn thing because I think it's just fine how it is. First judge scored at 98. And I was just like, whoa, you know, it was just like, and my heart was racing through my chest because somebody got it. And I think that happens a bit when you take risks. It wasn't a really obvious image, you know, it wasn't like, oh, I know what that is next. And playing it safe generally doesn't give you the opportunity to win competitions. But if you don't play it safe, you're risking totally bombing as well. So that's a bit of a dance, you know, in this whole process of how and what you prepare and why. And, you know, I've been doing it long enough that I can smile at it a bit. And my partner, Angie, knows that I can crack the absolute bejesus as well when I don't think I get what I deserve. So, and I kind of like that because it means I care. And if I'm just working and doing client work and not really pushing myself and not entering competitions, there's kind of often not as much passion involved, and I'm not as engaged in my work, and I'm maybe not pushing myself as hard, and I'm maybe not experimenting with things, and I'm maybe not reflecting on how I'm growing as a photographer as much because I haven't got a lodestone that's as clear to me as cycling around a year and coming back to the next competition and going, well, wait a minute, what have I done in the last year? What's different? How do I prepare better this time? Oh, I remember the mistakes I did before. All right, I promised myself this year wasn't going to do that again. All right, who do I ask, or what software can I use, or, you know? So there's a big process for me that's quite beneficial, but it's a bit of a yo-yo.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the subjectivity and going from a 78 to a 98 in scores. It really does come down to what impact and what story your image can provide to the judges in a short period of time. And that's definitely something that we'll talk about quite a bit tonight. But if it doesn't immediately resonate, and I think this is probably true with any judging where there's a reasonable volume and a reasonable time frame that judges have to get, of images that judges have to get through. If it doesn't grab someone immediately, and in the appers, of course, it only has to grab one, and then they've got the time then to passionately argue their case towards pushing for a gold or a silver with distinction or something like that. But if it doesn't grab anyone, if there's not something there that just hooks people in, then it's likely that the image will be sort of put on the also ran pile.
Yeah, there's a literal, almost like a technique you can apply in that regard. So in the physical print awards, like New Zealand, Australian, and the American ones, you literally have a panel of live judges sitting there. So like Nick said, the first thing you need to do is have enough impact or stimulate enough curiosity that they want to get up out of their chair and have a closer look. And so if you don't, you know, have enough oomph in your image to get past that first thing, then it's exactly like Nick said, they might just slip through the cracks. So often you will think about, well, if they do come up really, really close, what's another thing that I can maybe reward the judges for doing so? Is it going to be in just a level of refinement of the print? Is it going to be a small little feature that adds part of a narrative that you can't see from further back? All of a sudden they go up and go, oh, I didn't see, oh my God. Oh, and then there's a whole nother level again that they can appreciate or bounce back and reflect on. And that's a bit of a tool that's probably more indicative to the print awards, which have that process. If you're aware of that process, you might be more conscious about the kind of images that may, you know, give you a bit of a boost up in that regard. Whereas a lot of the online competitions, which is probably most of them really, you know, what you see is what you get on the screen. And having judged a lot of those as well, it's quite a difference between judging a contest at 1,000 pixels and judging a contest at 3,000 pixels. And you never quite know with some contests what size frame you're going to get. And you get a 1,000 pixel image that's this big on your screen, you're sort of like, oh, what, is that detail good? I can't really tell. So, and you know, you can't be absolutely sure that the judges are looking at the same image on a digital screen, because they might have a different contrast ratio, or they might not have calibrated their screen for a little while, and it's a little bit more sort of subjective, and they're not sitting in a room full of other people in that moment. You know, they might have the you know, the kids in the next room that they occasionally take a break or talk to. So it's less, I guess, controlled in atmosphere. And I know Luke's been a part of some as well, like the Anzangs, I think, where they get together and it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah,
I
it's a
haven't been
pretty
part of
unique
that process
competition,
yet.
that
Luke,
one.
do you want to talk about that?
The Australian Geographic Nature Photographer of the Year competitions are probably the best nature photography competition in, I guess, the Southern Hemisphere. There's quite a big one in England that's very good, but it's quite unique in the sense that it has, maybe not unique, but there's not many that have an exhibition attached to it that actually tours as well. Whereas I think it always runs at the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, but also more recently has also been shown in Sydney. So it's if you get shortlisted, not only do you get the chance of being a finalist and maybe even winning a category and getting a cash prize, but you also get your image in the exhibition, which in some senses is as good as a prize anyway, because you know, everyone loves the idea of having their work exhibited, and you don't really have to do anything extra for that to occur. So that's quite cool. Been fortunate to have that happen a couple of times over the years. I haven't been quite so lucky the last couple of years, but yeah, it's all part of the fun. But yeah, it's definitely great competition, and it's, for me, that's the style of competition that I really enjoy entering, because it's much more related, or it fits better with the style of images that I'm creating now. Whereas in the past, I felt like you know, I was almost creating images for competitions, and now I feel more like I'm just creating the images that I create and then try and find a competition that actually suits that particular style of image. It feels a bit more authentic to me, I suppose, at least from my own personal perspective. So yeah, it's a bit about that competition.
Yeah, there's certainly some formulas that you can apply to competition entries that you know are going to do well in a particular type of competition. And I guess it also depends. You can look at who the judges are going to be and have a look at their style and see what sort of floats their boat, and maybe work out what images you're going to enter based on what judges there are and what style they like, or you might take a base image and then process it to a certain style, knowing that that's the sort of thing that the judges like. And I'm with you, Luke. I'm not really keen on doing that sort of thing, and good on anyone who is, because that's what a competition's about. It's a competition, and if you can give yourself an edge by doing that sort of thing, then that's fantastic. But I really, as a photographer, I enjoy the image first, and then if there's a competition that might suit it, then I might throw it in. But yeah, the Australian Geographic competition really is a great one, and for me, I probably feel it's a more even level playing field as such, because the rules are a little bit tighter than, well, a lot tighter than some of the other landscape photography competitions out there. And for nature photographers, I suppose that can be important.
Yeah, I'll probably, in my personal opinion, I feel like you're asking for trouble by trying to research judges, because they might have changed the scene, or you don't know if they're actually going to be on that day. Like in APA, you have a pool of judges, and it can change any minute or any second who's actually going to be there judging a print, and there's like 50 of them, and they get swapped around.
Yeah, I
Whereas
was
maybe a
thinking
strong
less.
competition like Anzang that's different in that if they have consistent judges year to year, and you really get a sense for the style of work they do. But I'd say the majority of competitions you really don't really know, or you're not going to know who the judges
Yeah,
are
but
very well.
Anzang, they rotate more. As Geo Nature Photographer, they rotate the judges every year as well. So you would I think it's still beneficial to go through the portfolio of the judges and see what they do shoot, and maybe that can help you refine the style of image that you would, you have a pool of images to choose from that might help influence which images you choose to enter. So that could be one way to help make that decision. But that's I think it's probably not as beneficial as maybe some other things you could do.
Well, what I would do though, which is along the exact same lines, and I highly recommend it to anyone, is have a really good look at the past winners
Absolutely.
and the galleries, because to me that's probably more of an empowering thing to do than the judges whose moods can change on the day. But you get a sense of the caliber of work, and I think it is fair to say that there is a certain culture and style of imagery that suits certain awards more than others. And I've come across that literally. I think some of them are a little bit consistent like that. Some of them it's a bit hard to tell. But if when I first saw the Appers, I saw it was a show that actually came to Hobart of all things. And I saw this APPR. I was just like, and I looked at the images and I thought, oh my God, they've been photoshopped to bear Jesus. And it's the Australian Professional Photoshop Awards. That's what it is. That's what APPA stands for. And that's literally what I thought it was, because there wasn't a single image that I could see on the wall that was a straight photograph. They all had the crap manipulated out of them. And they were all doing really well. And they were amazing in their own right, but they were highly refined and highly polished in post-production. And at the time, 10 years ago, I was a bit of a purist, and I didn't know how I felt about that. And yet as a professional, I kind of started understanding that when the digital world started, how do you stand above an amateur photographer that has the same camera gear as you? And one of the skill sets that allows you to do that does take years to evolve, is some of the post-production skills, particularly in a commercial and advertising sense, which are a huge part of that world. And you're expected to be able to have those skills on tap. So in that regard, I started to learn to respect, a little bit of the vision and how well those skills were used, and whether they were actually supporting or augmenting the story or the narrative. And sometimes they can. And now I'm in groups of photographers, like in the Light Collective, where all of them are just absolute weapons at doing that sort of thing. And I've had to judge, I don't know how many different illustrative categories where it's all about that, and commercial categories and advertising. But going back to the culture point, here's an example. Like if you walk into, say, the Head-On Awards, totally different. I could imagine I could put probably 75% of the top scoring Head-On Awards into Appers, and I could probably guarantee you that they would bomb and they wouldn't do well at all. That competition is not about highly polished images. It's all about raw, humanitarian, documentary based, storytelling. And they're really not caught up on the technical. They're very, very much into the narrative and the story and the message and the power of the moment. And so that's an example where I'd say the culture is actually really quite different. And sometimes, though different, I don't get it. I got second one year in landscape with a abstract aerial image, and the image that won landscape was a giraffe lying down on a blue tarp in the grass. I still have no idea what that's about, and I've been a judge for a long time. And then the following year, the images that won landscape were the inside of restaurants. One was a Pizza Hut restaurant. It did happen to be in Cairo, I think, so you could see a tiny bit of an Egyptian pyramid out the window. But the other one was a Chinese restaurant. It didn't even have a window. It was just a table and a chair and the wall and no people, and that was it. And that one, got second, I think. And I was just like, so go figure. I don't know who those judges are. And I look at them every year just going, what am I missing here? or you get, does anyone remember that really controversial one? Was it the Mossman Awards maybe? Where it was like the spit on the back of a negative from a 90-year-old
That was a portrait award, yeah.
friend or something that won or something like that. And it's just like, so it's not always rocket science about what's going to do well. But you know, you get some competitions that have a bit of a consistent kind of look. You know, like I'd say some of the American competitions are quite influenced by quite a polished style of exposure blending in particular is a really, really strong technique that's used at a lot of the high-end awards, and also focal length blending, focal blending. So you see these foregrounds of these beautiful big flowers that are like this big, and then you see the big mountains in the background. You're like, well, how does that work? And there's a very, very polished kind of look and feel, you know, that kind of spilled over from, say, the what was it, 500px or whatever it was, and some of those sort of ones. So if you look through, you'll notice that, say, like I think the International Landscape Photography of the Year has a bit of a flavor like that, and that there's quite a lot of American judges, and there's quite a lot of really highly polished work that rises to the top. So having a look through that, you know, if you've got a raw sort of uncut documentary shot, it might be better off and head on. So it is worth spending some time looking at the galleries, and also it's a great source of inspiration because there's some phenomenal work coming through and some great ideas and crops and viewpoints you never thought of, and ways of finishing and color palettes and different ways to interpret the same subject that you're familiar with that you've never seen done that way. And that's part of the beauty of the process. Like, I'll stop in a sec so I give it a catch for breath, but I kind of said in my brief for the show, like, one of the things I was going to say, like how to set up your mindset so you're going to be a winner regardless. And I really feel like the greatest benefit for you happens before you press the send button and it goes to the contest. Because if you think about it, all that time before, you've been digging into your files, you've been maybe bouncing off people, you've been looking at contests and other work, you've maybe been pushing yourself to come up with some new images for the awards, you've maybe got critique from other people or run it past a critique session, and you've developed sort of quite a lot as a photographer, as an image maker, before you even send it. To me, like the awards are like the icing on the cake, because you don't really have any say or control about how it's going to do. Peter Eastway, I think, says it quite well, and he's probably the most experienced judge in Australia or close to it. If you're in the top 20%, anyone could win. Because even though, like, judges, you know, a lot of the judges are pretty experienced, don't get me wrong, but they're all flavored by their own filters of experience of life, or their love of a certain genre, or their understanding of artwork and the homage that your work might be representing. And that is a filter that leaks through, which is why they pretty much always have more than one. At an APA, they have 5 on the panel, and they don't always, and this is quite deliberate, they don't always just have landscape photographers on the landscape category. And there's good reason for that, because some of those guys have seen it all, and it's just like, and they're a bit tired, you know, oh, I've seen that, and they lose that freshness and that kind of original feel, or that impact that can come from something that's actually a really wonderful image. And so they'll deliberately put some people on the panel that are less specifically working in that genre, who, you know, won't necessarily know where every single one of those photographs is taken, or, you know, like, oh, I know where that is, oh, I know where that is, oh, I know what they've done there. They're just more there to judge the image that's in front of them. So again, that's kind of what I like about that cycle, and that sort of level of unpredictability in some of the judging about who's going to be there. There you go. I need a glass of water after that.
What do you think about that? Like, you're saying that you might have other, you know, judges from other genres judging competitions, but then when you get results like you get in Head On, where there might be a image that's very hard to interpret as a landscape winning the category, do you think it's actually not helping and maybe disincentivizing people from entering that in the future, because their landscapes aren't even really being you know, honoured in that sense?
Well, I think it's an opportunity to learn and grow, because your understanding about what a landscape image means isn't necessarily somebody else's. And they might be looking at it in a completely different and maybe quite educated way that's bigger than your little brain is, or our little brain is used to encompassing what that genre can mean. So there's a lot of, obvious traditional interpretations for landscape, but, and this is where, and we'll get into this, the understanding of the rules and the category rules in particular is really important, because some of the briefs are so broad, it is actually anything goes, and you could just shoot the spit on the back of somebody's negative, like, and it's within the rules, and it's sort of like, well, if you've got that much latitude, then people are going to use that latitude. And it might be that the kind of work that rises to the top is the work that's really edgy and that's really different and that's really original and is really going somewhere different, because the rest of the body of the images that I see might be all kind of same. And so how do you choose a winner when you've got a whole bunch of shots that are kind of a similar ilk, and all of a sudden something comes up that totally blows your mind and challenges you? Like, as a judge, you're like, wait a minute, am I missing something here? Or how do I connect the dots with this communication here? And it might start connecting dots that you didn't expect. And that's something I love about judging, and I've learned a huge amount from, is trying to let go of my obvious and quick interpretations and be open to ones that I haven't thought of yet, or that I haven't yet found an example to connect the dots together. And sometimes it takes another judge next to me to do it, and I sit there going, holy smokes, I never thought of that in a million freaking years. I am humbled and being educated, which is what I love. And I will not lie, I will say in the last 10 years, I've learned as much, if not more, about image making from judging as I have from taking photographs. But if I'm sitting on the panel, I remember one time, my first year I judged in New Zealand, and I don't know if you know about how these systems work. I think there was 7 grandmasters at the time, and 4 of them were sitting next to me. We're talking like in Australia and New Zealand. So I was just like, and I was the 5th person and I was a newbie. And the briefing on the judging is you can't repeat anything that's said by any other judges. And I was the last one to speak. And I was like, how the freaking heck do I come up with something that these guys haven't already seen? Because there's about 150 years more experience than I've got sitting right next to me. And as much as that was freaking hard, I was like, you know what? I'm going to dig deep, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to look harder, and I'm going to look deeper, and I'm going to look further, and I'm going to think broader. And, and I did. But it took a lot, it took the pressure cooker of that situation. And, almost like that, it was a make or break moment of, I could have just crumbled in awe of what was around me, or I could have backed myself and said, you know what? I think they missed it, but I'm going to bring this up. And then you get a few nods and you're like, oh shit. So it's not, I mean, I make it sound like a bit of an ego game, but I mean, it's sort of more as that educational opportunity is amazing. I actually, when I first started judging, I was sitting down with a notepad in the back of the room and I would write down words. I never thought of that way to describe that something. I understand what they meant, but I didn't know how to describe it myself, and they just did it perfectly. And I'd have a little notepad, and I think over the years, I built up a lot of what I'd call visual literacy, which means I've got a greater capacity to explain and interpret images verbally than I did before. And that was by actively listening and learning from my betters and from the masters around me. And I think, as much as it's not hugely important, it does help when I'm working with someone or working on a project together, and I've got an idea and I otherwise wouldn't know how to say it. Now I kind of do. And so things can evolve. It's one of the extra skill sets.
If you have something that challenges the genre, such as your lying down giraffes or the inside of a restaurant, that sort of thing for a landscape, it can also lead to notoriety for the competition. It can lead to widespread media coverage, and it can lead to a rebellion of sorts. I mean, probably a good example in Australia was Ken Duncan setting up his own photographic competition after he spat banana at the interpretation of landscape. And so he opened his it ran for a couple of years, his real landscape photography awards, which was widely talked about in positive and negative terms all through the photographic community. And the whole thing really blew up. It was quite enjoyable to sit back and watch the commentary, actually.
Enjoyable.
Well, you know what I mean. You know, Ken's been an outspoken advocate for keeping landscape photography on the more real side, for whatever that means. But it's you know, with someone that has such a huge you know, a huge reputation and a huge portfolio of amazing images, it's really interesting to see his perspective. Love him or hate him for what he says, but I know he's also commented on the winners of the appers, like the overall winners and that sort of thing, and suggested that it's not so much photography, but it's something else. And of course, that's his opinion. But that blow up by Ken sort of has helped promote photography generally, and to get people talking about it. So it's another interesting perspective on the on what competitions can actually bring.
Yeah, there was a major event that happened around that. It was partly, it might have even been one that Ken was referring to. So there was a photographer that won some seriously major awards in New Zealand and Australia and Britain and America. And she'd been doing so for about 3, 4, 5 years, and had finally got figured out that she had actually broken some of the rules and some of her entries. And it blew up hugely, and they literally put everything on hold. And for about half a year, there was this huge kind of spew about it. And I think it was her winning APA that actually stirred, was it APA? I think that stirred Ken up.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
And yet, if you looked at what it was about, like in the Australian Awards, there was 12 categories. And in order to have a chance to win, you need to win your category. And the category that she won was advertising and commercial. And in that world and in that genre, and also in the rules, you can do absolutely anything.
Nearly. She still managed to break the rules, though.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, she actually, to me, she just didn't need to. She's so brilliant at what she does. I don't even know why she even bothered. But my point being is they could have chosen the sport as the winner. They could have chosen wedding as the winner. They could have chosen whatever. And it just happened that her folio, which within its genre was perfectly suited to the content and the category rules, apart from what we'll go into. And so it was a little bit unusual that was the folio that was chosen to represent the Australian Photographer of the Year. And so it just happened that her folio, because it was within that category, was all about that. So it presented a body of work that really was photo illustrative work. Whereas if they'd chosen another folio, it would have been totally different. It just happened to be that hers won. And so it really threw the spanner in the works. Well, not spanner in the works, but it really projected that heavy question about, you know, that's been ongoing and will be ongoing. What is photography, and where does photo illustration and photography sort of blend and merge into a grey, murky area to be lost forever in the world of the purist, you know? And that's not going to finish. But she actually did break the rules in that she used, because she can put, and I know people that put up to 150 elements into one single image, no joke. And in some of these competitions now, you have to provide the raw files for all of them. And she had been using clip art, which is basically pieces that were grabbed off the internet that she didn't actually photograph. And to be honest, they weren't actually big pieces in there. And there was already 100 other parts that were just hers. So I don't really know quite the mindset of why she got into that. But she was very, very successful. And I personally think the communication and the narrative in that body of work was actually amazing. And the finesse and the way she put it together and the skills is still incredible. But, you know, but when she finally got found out, it then forced all the competitions to go back through their rules. And then, you know, the dominoes tumbled, and they had to spend a year basically figuring out who else actually won these competitions. And I was in the running for one of them, because I was finalist for International Photography of the Year, and she just beat me. And I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll get it. And I went to somebody else, but it was kind of like, it was all over the place. And I don't know, Nick, whether I think maybe the Ken side of the publicity was potentially maybe beneficial to the industry overall, but certainly the the award structure and the culture around awards, I felt quite like it took a bit of a hit, to be honest.
Well, a similar thing happened actually in AusGeo Nature Photographer of the Year a few years ago, and
true,
one
yeah,
reason
yeah.
why they're actually so stringent now with requiring raw files was actually, I think, one of the I'm hope I'm not talking incorrectly, but one of the winners, well, the winner was found to be actually digitally manipulated. And given the fact that it is meant to be about nature and what happens in nature, they actually implemented that rule from that point forward. So I think in some ways too, those fiascos or whatever you put it can actually help to drive competition to actually have a better rule structure that supports the award going forward as well, and stop further scandals and things like that happening. Yeah, so that's interesting.
There's another famous one that's worth mentioning just for the fun of it. The raw file was submitted and there was nothing wrong with the raw file. The problem was that the gentleman that won the award, which was a wildlife award, had taken a stuffed anteater from the front gate of the national park, taken it into a termite mound and photographed it in situ, and he actually won a major award, which some sleuth pointed out and was able to prove that it was indeed a stuffed anteater from the front gate of the national park. But that was
I was taken at night, and I remember thinking, "Wow, to get an anteater sitting that still for 30 seconds, that's phenomenal."
Yeah. It didn't. Once you looked at it, it didn't ring true at all. And he was unable to produce any other images before or after that were able to prove it. But it even got so far as that there were experts in biological, in the way that animals sort of move and that sort of thing. I think they got 5 different experts in that sort of field to look at the photo and look at the actual stuffed anteater taken from different angles, and they were able to prove through biomechanics or something that it was definitely the same stuffed anteater. It was really quite a big story and quite an interesting thing. But there's big prize money we're talking with these competitions, and so the ethics of it, apart from just a general morality, if you're defrauding the competition by completely sort of getting outside the rules, then it's actually it's almost criminal, not quite, but almost criminal. So people are going to feel very passionate when someone doesn't follow the rules and is found out. That's for sure.
Yeah, that happened, and there was actually a fairly significant amount of money involved, and there was talk of legal action, and it was deeply considered, and it sort of went there. But another point of conjecture for me, and maybe this is probably one of my bugs in my fly a little bit. Like, I feel like do some of the awards kind of justify the cost of entering? Like, if you get no feedback and you don't get anything unless you're in the top 3, and nobody's writing any critique for you, or even getting a number, and you're paying $35 US an image and it's just digital, like, how much of some of these are like money-making schemes as opposed to like actually competitions that are there to benefit the wider community? I mean, both happens at the same time, and I don't think you should expect people to put all their time and love into creating these things without it being commercially viable. But I remember early on, when the first digital competitions in particular started springing up, I was kind of like doing the numbers in my head, like, they got 4,000 entries and it's 35 US seats. That's like, $250,000 or whatever. I'm sort of like, holy crap. The prize is like $5,000. I'm like, what's going on here? Where's all this money going? And, and it does take a lot to set up some of these bigger ones, more than we realize, I think. But I don't know. You got any thoughts about that? Is that sort of
I've thought a little bit about that. I think it all comes down to, I guess, what you're willing to put up in terms. I guess, how likely are you going to get a return on your investment in some ways? Like if you're going to spend a fortune on entries, you'd like to think that you've got a pretty good chance of recouping those costs with a ranking in the, or a prize, I suppose. But I do like competitions that have maybe like a top 100, and at least if you're not first, second, or third, for example, you're at least in a top 100, and you've got some sort of idea of where you rated if you got into those upper echelons. But yeah, with competitions where you just get a first, second, or third and nothing else, that is really hard to. I think Head On certainly like one of those where I think they do have a short list actually, but there's no additional feedback. It does make it quite challenging, and I think photographers also like to have say that they made it into the top 100 or have some sort of a something to beat their chest about. And so that's also nice to have. So that's sort of where my mind is at it. Certainly some of the competitions seem to be quite expensive to enter. And so that's probably also another motivation for why I've decided to go with certain competitions that I just really enjoy being a part of and giving them my money rather than competitions that, the likelihood of success is pretty low. And also, I don't get as much enjoyment out of it or feedback as well. So certainly sort of where my point of view is coming from these days.
Yeah, I think some of the competitions have gone a bit on the nose over time if they don't provide something back other than just the general the prize money or the top 100 or the book or whatever. And we've seen also the successful competitions have grown over time and offered different things and are very clear on what you do get or don't get for your money's worth. And I think it's really good because a lot of photographers do the maths and sort of go, wow, there's an awful lot of money being pumped into this. Where's it all going? But I mean, if you've got 8 judges and all the web hosting to set up and all the time and the competition prizes and all that thing, I'm sure a lot of the money that's earned from the competition entry fees gets eaten up in that sort of thing. And there's an entrepreneurial aspect to it. These are photographers that are setting up these competitions that also are running businesses and need to eat and whatnot, and good on them for doing so. But I think it's evolved over time, these digital competitions particularly, and people are starting to see where the good ones are and the not so good ones, and those that are good and offer a bit more have been successful and continue to be successful. It's interesting, there was a charitable one just done recently, which I only came across after it was judged, and it was only the other day that it was announced. It's interesting how they all name themselves, but this was World Landscape Photographer, and it was run by or brainchild of a YouTuber photographer by the name of Nigel Danson. And they had it was a lot of the money raised from that, which was relatively cheap to enter, went to charity and to COVID-19 charities. And I thought that was another sort of twist on what we've seen before. And they ended up with nearly 5,000 entries, and the outcomes from the winners, I mean, some of the images are just stunning. So yeah, just another twist on it, the charitable competition as opposed to the commercial competition.
Yeah, I think
also those competitions where, I don't know what happened to your camera there, Paul. It's your white knuckles.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. I was switching to my big screen
where they're you're very charitable for entering because you're donating your images to them as well. So you do have to be very careful about the terms and conditions, and every now and then you'll see a competition come along, and sometimes I'm even approached to help to promote a competition, and they you look at the terms and conditions and kind of think, well, I'm not going to help you increase your stock library of images. So you really do have to be careful. I'm sure every photographer has come across that, but if you haven't, make sure you look at the terms and conditions, especially if the competition isn't one that has been sort of widely heard of. Certainly the more popular competitions that a lot of people are entering are totally fine that way. I guess there's one exception to that. Sometimes they do have a clause in there so that they can use your image to help promote the competition, which I think is totally fine, because they need to obviously show who won last year and encourage more entries for the following year. But if they're saying that you give them all your rights, then that's I don't think that's a very good deal at all.
Mm. And there's been people, there's one person in particular that's done a lot of work towards the integrity of photo competitions within the terms and conditions, and that's William Long, who's for years run off his own time, run a website called Photo Watchdog, which there's a page on Facebook. Now, I'm not quite sure if William's still running that at the moment. I know he sometimes suspends it for a while, but he approaches competition organisers and points out in their terms and conditions where there might be some problems, and negotiates with them to change those terms and conditions in cases where they're not so great. And depending on the feedback that he gets from them and the changes that they do or don't make, he gives a rating towards that competition, top dog or good dog or bad dog, that sort of thing. And it's a really simple way of rating it. And he's done such a service over the years for the photography industry in bringing companies, and it's often companies that run these competitions, as well as tourism organisations and that sort of thing, but bringing them to account and just pointing out that the photographic industry isn't a free ride. You can't just build a folio of images to use for whatever you like just by running a competition, and good on him for doing so. And it really is worth digging deep into the terms and conditions, particularly if something pops up that hasn't popped up before. And that's a good example of what you can do.
And sometimes I think those companies actually put a clause in there that sounds very, what's the word? That they're trying to get free images essentially, but they actually it's just legalese that they've picked up from somewhere that basically they didn't realise meant that photographers could get worried about that. So sometimes I've even spoken to these organisations that are running these competitions and said, I can't support this because of this reason. It says that you have to give you the rights to the image, and they then go back and say, well, actually, that's definitely not what we're trying to do here. So we'll change those terms. So that certainly can happen as well. So I think it sort of goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, you want to give them benefit of the doubt, but there is certainly a lot of tourism organisations in particular that have used the amateur photo contest market as a way of never having to hire a pay photographer again in their life. And they've done that fairly deliberately. It's had a sort of an impact on an element of the professional world of photographers as well, because there's so many people out shooting that are just happy or excited to have their image up anywhere, that they're not really that fussed about the commercial rights because they're not trying to make a living out of it, and that's being scooped up very nicely, thanks. So it is be a little bit conscious of that and choose whether you want to support that, and it doesn't take too long to figure that out and their terms and conditions that's actually the case. If we're going back to prize money again, I had a little beef going on with what's kind of interesting is we have the Australian Professional Photography Awards, which is supposedly debatably the pinnacle of some elements of photography in the country. And if you win, New South Wales Photography of the Year, you might get $1,000, and that's it. No one else gets anything. And if you go and enter, the Australian Amateur Photography Awards, you might get $15,000 or $20,000 worth of prizes, and then another $8,000 if you get second, and another $5,000 you get third. So there's this huge discrepancy between some of the professional contests and some of the amateur ones, and and you just almost get nothing in the professional realm relative to the amateur ones, which sort of leaves me scratching my head. Is what sort of message is that? What's that saying about the industry, that we can't even rummage up any prize money for the people that are doing it for a living? So that sort of makes me smile a
is
little
it in
bit.
Saudi Arabia or somewhere where there's a massive prize, a huge cash prize for, I can't remember what the name of it is.
150,000 or something, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I saw one was actually the image that won, one of these more controversial sort of bigger ones, was actually taken on a photo workshop, and it was completely like fabricated photo shoot, and somebody had a shot pulled back of about 25 photographers on a workshop with this lady and a baby that was getting paid to stand there and look whatever way while they just shot the crap out of her. It was in Vietnam or somewhere.
Yeah, well, that's just come up on the YouTube chat actually. What do people think of the new travel photography rules that don't allow for the setup of images such as Vietnamese fishermen, etc.? So obviously that's in relation to what you're talking about there, Paul.
Yeah, and if you look into the rules for, say, the Silver Lining Awards, which I've just entered tonight and judging next week, they've actually changed the rules so that if you have taken an image on a workshop, it's not actually valid to use, or under educational direction of someone. Partly for that reason, I guess, because you can kind of pay people essentially to set up photographs for you. And I guess that's not really representing one of the great skill sets of an image maker, is actually looking and finding the image in the first place.
Yeah, well, and I think in most of I think all of the AIPP APA rules, isn't it, that if you're on a workshop, it's actually not a valid entry.
Yeah. I think there's a slight grey area where if the workshop is a tour as opposed to like education based, and it's literally just about getting you to special locations, and then once you're there, you're on your own doing your thing. So there's this kind of like grey area where they talk about education or instructional based workshops. So that's probably a little bit of a grey one, but anyway, we're sort of focusing on a lot of the less savoury sides of it. But I think there's a lot to be said if you do well, like this image behind me. I think I brought it up before on some of our other chats, and I haven't sort of bothered changing it, sorry, but at the same time, it means a lot to me. So this single image was the first image I ever entered into a contest in my life, and it ended up being the highest scoring print in Tasmania, and it almost won the highest scoring print in Australia in the same year. And nobody knew who I was, and I didn't know much about what the hell I was doing. And by the end of it, going through the contests, I was sitting down having dinner with Christian Fletcher and Tony Hewitt going, "Who the heck are you, dude?" And it was all came from this picture. And it started opening doors, and it gave me a lot of inspiration and confidence, and I met a lot of people. And it was hard to enter because I didn't know anyone, and I went up to Sydney not knowing a single person, and I was so nervous about going in there. I walked around for 3 hours before even going in, and I actually missed the judging of the print. And I came in and I saw it up on the wall, and it was on the gold distinction wall, and I was like, "Oh, I don't know much about it. I think that's pretty good." And someone goes, "Is that yours?" And I'm like, "Yeah." They're just like, "Who are you?" And it was like, and I just stood there, and this procession of people just kept coming up to me, asking me about the image and where it was taken and how I did it, and wanted to, shake my hand as who I was. And it was sort of like, it was a bit of an ego boost, but at the same time, it was a beautiful recognition and a confidence boost as well. And then I ended up getting 4 more images that did really well behind it. So it wasn't just a one-off. So there is something to be said, when it happens, that sometimes it can be a certain validation. But I think the trap is falling into relying on that, or expecting that, or being hugely disappointed or put off your game if you didn't, which is why I started with that example of when I kind of, bombed in my mind and won, and I'd said, "Stuff you guys, I believe in this image." And it was a bit about the panel and who was in front of it. And that's always going to be the case to some extent. So I think it's normal and natural to really, part of any sort of competitive realm, no matter what it is about comparison. I mean, that's the nature of competition. Who's higher than somebody else? It's at the beating heart of what it is. So it's not easy to put sort of that aside. So in some ways you can celebrate that. Some people just love it. It's a roll of the dice to some extent, really. you just, but you've got to be in it to win it. As they say, you got to have a go, or you're never going to win, and you might surprise yourself. So if you've got the motivation and the time and a bit of money, and you haven't tried it, maybe start having a look at some of the ones that suit. Now, I actually made a list the other day because I started doing some online critiquing for exactly this sort of thing. And there's a very awesome Indian photographer, actually, and he's been shooting for 35 years, and he's exhibited, and he's really got beautiful work, but he hasn't put stuff in competitions before. So I spent 3 hours with him the other night, just refining down, his folio and curating the work, and giving what I thought was my feedback as a judge about composition and lighting and the use of color, and whether narrative could be increased. And now he's come back after 2 weeks later, and he's re-refined all his images, and he wants another session to sort of build it up. And so I actually, he asked me what competitions to enter, and I sort of went, oh my God, how long's a piece of string? And I actually, Lukey's got his own version that's more extensive than mine, but mine's
I've
actually
updated
quite
it for a
basic.
while.
But I'll share my screen, and I'll put it on there, and I'll maybe just highlight a few of them. Are you guys up for that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go for it, mate.
All right. Just give me a second here. So is my sheet, is that coming up?
Yep.
So they're a little bit all over the place, but I'll skip through really quickly and just go like, that's just what I came up with in a couple of hours. And I have heard of a lot of them, and some of them I haven't. But there are some pretty big ones internationally, like the Siena Awards is from Italy. And I actually had a crack and entered that last week, so I've never tried it. The French Parisian Awards PX3 is held in really high regard in Europe. And some of these competitions are bigger than the ones over here, and we've never heard of them. The Moscow International, the Tokyo International. Iggy does pretty well on the Nat Geo Photo Traveler most years. The American one is a WPPI, which is the print-based award in Vegas, baby, every year, which has a lot of parallels in the culture and style. Probably a bit more of a wedding and portrait-based event, but at the same time, it covers all genres as well. I went and judged that last year, which was pretty awesome. Online one, but a very esteemed one in America, the PDN Photo Annual. A lot of commercial and advertising work in there, but a lot of kind of cutting edge documentary stuff as well. There's the New Zealand Photography Awards, which I'm judging soon. And that's called the Iris Awards, and that has an element that's open to international photographers. The One Island, I think, is US based. I've entered that a few times. The Spider Awards, that might be a Y actually. I think that's more of a black and white based awards. I'm not sure if that's British, Lukey, or do you know where that one's from?
Oh, I can't even remember. I think it's American actually, but yeah, I did quite well in that one year. But
yeah, but it's got quite a long running, doesn't it? Like it's a fairly established one.
Yeah.
The IPA, which I get confused between the IPA and the Fine Art Photography Awards. I think they're kind of one and the same. In the USA, there's the Sony World Photography Awards, which is maybe a little bit more about documentary-based work, but it's a bit of a mix.
A whole
Is it
bunch
quite
of categories
broad, Lukey, or is it a mixed categories? Or
with Sony, it's a whole bunch of
the
different
Sony World
categories.
Photography
So
Awards.
it's quite a massive competition, that one.
Yeah,
so.
it's huge, isn't it? The Monochrome Awards is a purely black and white one. And the Mono Awards, I believe, is an Australian-based one that was just done, I think, last month. I think the entry's just finished. The Chromatic Photography Awards, I think, might be a US-based one. These are three that I came across that are international. I'm not super familiar with them, but I think they're pretty big.
Yeah, the HRPA one's the one I was referring to earlier with the big cash prize. Mel Sinclair just mentioned.
That's right. That was a massive cash prize, and I hadn't even heard of it. So I actually met a couple of photographers that were so incredibly talented that they considered entering and winning competitions part of their annual income stream because they won so much. So they would actually dedicate time and resources to entering, knowing that there's a pretty good chance that they were going to bring quite a bit of money home and it was worth the time. So I don't know if they do it the same, but there's different models of thinking around it. British Journal of Photography, Kuala Lumpur Photographic Awards, Lens Culture is one I've entered a few times. That's probably quite a good one for testing the waters because it's designed more as an emerging talent. A lot of the competitions have, you know, if you get into the certain finals, they'll run an exhibition in New York or somewhere that people can reach out to and see online. A lot of them create books, actually. Although the International Landscape Photography actually does that. The Top 101 comes out in a beautiful fine art book you can purchase. There's a few competitions that do that. British Journal of
Yeah,
Photography is
Australian
very long
Geographic Nature
established one.
Photographer does that as well. They do a beautiful book every year.
Oh, actually, they do too. Yeah, you've had a few rock star spots in there, Lukey and Nick, both of you. Woo-hoo-hoo.
Yeah.
I haven't entered that one yet, and that's partly because
don't enter. Don't.
I don't know if it suits my style of work.
No, it doesn't. No, don't enter.
You know, and so Lukey and I had this conversation a bit between he's been entering the Anzac and I've been entering, say, Appers, and both of us kind of feel like our work doesn't naturally suit maybe the other as much. It's debatable, and a lot of people might
I think
disagree.
I think you could always find a photo that fits a competition if you really looked hard enough. Or in most cases, I think it's probably more just a comfort thing for me, and just from that perspective, and
Yeah,
you know, having to do appers and create a print, and it's a lot of time to put towards something like that. So I find that's probably the biggest challenge in my lack of prioritization.
I mean, I've been following the appers for a very long time, and obviously Osgeo Awards and stuff like that. There's no way I'd enter the same images that I enter in Osgeo in the appers. I mean, it's just a completely different competition. They're just not. My images are just not suited generally for the appers. I would have to specifically look for and craft particular images to go into the appers, knowing the type of images that do really well in the appers and those that don't do so well. And it's somewhat dependent on the category, and that has sort of changed a little over the years, but it still is, yeah, completely different chalk and cheese.
And there are some chalk and cheese ones. There's some of the more sort of amateur orientated ones, like the Better Photography Awards, which I don't have any provision for professional photographers. There's the APS, which is a national club-based awards in Australia, I believe. That's
Better
pretty
Photography
massive
does
as well.
feedback as well, doesn't it? But doesn't I think the entries actually get a little bit of a
which one? The Better Photography or the?
I think it's Better Photography. I know the Focus.
Okay, yeah. I think there are a few dedicated to doing that. I know, like in the state awards and the IPP and in the national awards, they now have a dedicated ethos where every single print gets spoken feedback, no matter what they score. And obviously, if a print gets challenged, you get a lot more. But and that can add like a whole day to the judging, which costs thousands of dollars to have all these judges flown in and all the different, you know, machinery to run the live streaming. It's a big deal to commit to that. But they're really quite committed to feedback. And this year, because of the COVID, they had to cancel the state awards. I was meant to be in Victoria a few weeks ago judging the Victorian Photography Awards, which I've done about 7 or 8 times now. I love it. And they canned it, but they've come up with a Silver Linings Awards instead. And they've opened it up pretty widely to a much broader kind of base, I guess, to encourage a lot of people to get involved. And they've reduced the prices down from the print-based awards considerably. It was only $20 an image, actually, on the early bird, which is pretty affordable. And one was free for starters. And they had no less than, I think, 9 different free online 2 to 3 hour long critique sessions with some of the best judges in the country giving up their time. I did one night on the abstract awards, and the feedback from that has been incredible at the caliber of feedback that people got and what they learned from it. Again, you know, so different from just getting a number and you're scratching your head sort of based on why. But maybe listening to some of those live awards, as Lukey suggested, is really quite valuable. Even just having them off on the side. I did a live one a few weeks ago on Adam Williams' YouTube channel, Adam Williams Creative on YouTube, and it was with myself and Tom Putt. And Tom actually was one of the people that took me under his wing, and I first learned to judge from. And what the beauty of that contest was, we weren't given any time limits. And it ended up going for 3.5 hours, and we spoke at length about every image and why. And so it's kind of rare to get access to that sort of caliber or depth or intensity of feedback. So I think you can actually go watch that if you just look up Adam Williams Curating on YouTube and maybe type in my name or Tom's, and it was an online competition. So that's kind of rare, and the feedback was really amazing from that too, because there's not a lot of resource quite like that out there. So moving on, you got the club awards. You got head on, of course, which is landscaping, portrait, and mobile generally. That's the very that's the one I keep scratching my head at every year about what does well, but I've given it a go a few times. There's a few more contemporary ones that are Australian based, the Olive Cotton Award, the National Portrait Prize, the Moran Contemporary Photographic Prize, and the Bonus Photographic Prize. And they're the kind of ones you probably want to just maybe take a bit of time and check out, because they're very, I guess contemporary is the word, which is probably because I don't know how else to describe it, but they're very sort of art orientated and social culture sort of orientated, and they have some very refined kind of high-end sort of art-based people judging them that I don't personally find very easy to predict what does well, and yet I appreciate, I guess, the depth of thought behind the people behind choosing those. And that these are ones that I haven't tried yet that I could probably maybe grow from having a go at, or even maybe having in the back of my mind over a year, if I come across a situation where I might be able to capture an image that would suit this kind of awards, just to see how it would fit. And I think the Moran's like $50,000 if you win. It's a fair chunk of change, and it's held in very high regard.
Mel mentioned on YouTube that's just got cancelled for this year.
Oh, I didn't know that actually. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So there are other ones. There's Australian Life Award, which City of Sydney, which is very much about the culture of life in Sydney. We should probably get Dex to go and clean that one up. The PSA is the Photographic Society of America, but it's actually global, and that's pretty massive. So that's kind of like maybe a little bit more of a club sort of style thing. But as I've learned many times, the caliber of photographers and clubs can be unbelievable. And half the time I go there, there's people that know way more than I do about all sorts of different things to do with photography, and I learn heaps. So there's no thing there. There's a European version of that, which is the International Federation of Photographic Art. And I actually remember entering this one quite a long time ago, a number of times, called the Trierenberg Super Circuit. And I think it's based out of Saudi Arabia, I think, but it's actually massive. And really, really passionate people behind it that really love what they do. And they produce books and so on of all the awards as well, and some pretty good prizes. So that's,
there's a few more you need to add to that list, Paul.
Yeah, there is.
Yep, there's
Lucky's got his own list.
Focus Awards, which is run by the Focus.
Yeah.
There's the what else is there? The International Pano Awards. I don't know if you had that on there or not.
Oh, I would be surprised.
Pano Awards. Yeah. There's also the what was the other one I was just thinking of?
International Photographer of the Landscape.
Yeah, International Landscape Photographer of the Year.
Man, I must have like missed a spot.
There's also the BBC and that's I don't know who it is now, but the Nature Photographer of the Year based in UK as well. They have a landscape category as well, which is
so the BBC Wildlife Awards.
I think it's just called Nature Photographer of the Year, but it's based in the UK.
There is wildlife as well.
Yeah.
The Australian Geographic Nature Photographer of the Year Awards, Paul, you've missed.
And of course, the David Malin Astrophotography Awards. You can't.
Oh yes. How do you spell Malin again?
Malin.
Yeah, not marlin as in the fish, which I've missed.
I think that's. I'm just looking at my old list. And I think
I actually had some of these on another page. I must have not.
And of course how can I forget the Sony Alpha Awards as well? If you're a Sony shooter, it's a must enter. And and you're not an advocate like me because I can't enter, but that's I had a lot of fun judging the entries to that last week in the Seascape category.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm judging the International Pano Awards this year, and it's actually one of the few competitions. In case you're wondering, most of these competitions we get to ask to judge, it's about the privilege, and you don't get a cent, and you might spend days doing it. That's generally how it works. But actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but this is one of the exceptions, which is nice. But I think they can literally throw 4,000 images at you at the same time.
Yeah.
So I haven't touched that one before, so I'm quite looking forward to that. And
there's been another suggestion for a competition, which is the Australian Photographer of the Year. I think.
I thought I had that APA. I don't think I said it.
With.
APA. Yeah.
So
yeah, they're good Australian ones.
Yeah, that was really good too. And then I think there's a couple that are run by Capture. Isn't there the Capture Emerging Photographer?
Yeah, I definitely there's a whole section.
And then there's also the Capture the Annual, which isn't really a competition, but you get a chance to submit to be in the magazine. I think they do a photography a landscape competition as well, don't they? The Australian Photography magazine.
Well, they have a generic sort of amateur one, but it's quite big. I mean, they're the kind of competitions that I sit there and go, how come their prizes are 15 times bigger than the professional ones? And I think it's a partly a reflection of the industry. Like somebody like Canon has kind of like given up supporting the professional market, and they put all their money into the amateur market. And so they're offering a lot of, and that's where probably for a lot of camera companies, the biggest volume of profit is for them. So that's where they aim, their support. It's like the professionals have got to use them. It's like a toolkit, need the tools. They're going to buy them anyway. So I don't know. That's probably a bit of a biased assessment, but I think there's an element of that in there sort of somewhere. They're all really significant ones.
Having a list like this is really important because there was one year where I did particularly well in competitions, and it wasn't actually a coincidence. What I actually did was I listed out all of the competitions I could think of very much like this. There was probably a few that I didn't put on the list because they just weren't something that I was interested in initially, but I actually went to every single website of every competition, and I looked at when they either signed up for their mailing list, or I looked at when the entries were closing, and I actually put a spreadsheet together, and it had all of those competitions. The next column was what year it was, whether I was going to enter that competition or not, so yes or no, and then I said, what date does it open, what date does it close, and then basically the status, and that actually calculated whether or not the competition was open and how many days I had left to enter. And so I could just open up that spreadsheet, and it would basically just tell me how many days I had to enter whichever competition that I was looking at entering. And I think based on that, I was able to enter about at least 10 competitions that I probably wouldn't have entered because I wasn't that organized. And so not only did I do that, but then I also, when the closing date was coming up, I also put that in my online, like my Google Calendar as well. So that way I was a little bit more coordinated and organized with it. It's not normally a trait that I enjoy, but it certainly paid off for this particular year. And I would suggest anyone that's looking at doing really well in competitions, or really well at entering competitions, has a bit of more, treat it a bit like a project, and actually sit down, work out which ones really suit your portfolio. And like Paul was saying earlier, go to the website for those competitions and see the previous winners, and whether your sort of style of imagery fits in with those, and really filter out which ones would suit you the best. And then actually, organize, either sign up to the mailing list if they haven't actually announced when they're going to open the competition, or you can put down when the closing date's going to be. Sometimes, unfortunately, you look it up and you realize you just missed out on a competition that would have been really good to enter, but you can always then record that for the following year as well. So I'm assuming you're already doing that, and it's pretty straightforward, but for me, that made a massive difference when I did that.
Like speaking of which, I got caught out tonight. So I was starting to prepare some entries for the Silver Lining Awards, assuming like most of them it goes till midnight. And I found out this morning it was 6 o'clock, and I was working all day, and I got home at 5:30 and just went, why? And then all of a sudden I was trying to come up with image titles and find the 7 different hard drives that all these different images were on, and they kept exporting wrong, and I just threw in whatever was left, and I would have had time to finish tonight after the show. Actually, so it's kind of like, so not only the date but the time.
I actually also did I tricked myself too. When I wrote in the close date, I actually made it a few days earlier as well. So
Smart
I
move.
built in a little bit of a buffer so that those sort of situations didn't happen, because I'm unfortunately one of the kind of people that would be entering, you know, at 11:58. I'm hoping that midnight doesn't click over before the file uploads onto their server. So I don't like doing that. So so I think that's not a bad strategy too.
So I think a lot of competitions have, to save a bit of money, they have early bird prices. So if you're ahead of the game, and that's, I guess, for them to, you know, get a sense of getting some money coming in so they can, you know, build up all the infrastructure and prizes and have that sort of ready to go. But also can save you a bit of money, especially if you're entering more than a few. So definitely keep an eye out for that. That's quite common. The other thing that's quite common, and some have a habit of, they get to the deadline and they go, oh, by the way, it's been extended for a week. There's some of them that actually do that every year. So if you're a little bit cheeky, you can kind of figure out which ones do that. I did find out one time that I thought a competition was one of those, and it wasn't. and I went to the organizer, sort of strutting my stuff, going, oh, don't you do this every year? And I'm like, no, that's the other competition. And I was like, oh.
Do we want to refocus a bit and talk about how people should prepare images, what they should, what sort of images they should enter, and that sort of thing, given the time?
Yeah, that's where I was heading next, Nick. So do you want to lead the way on that one, or?
Well, I mean, I'm probably not quite as experienced as you guys, but we're talking about it right at the start, that the image has to have some impact. Now, if you're talking about things like the Epson Pano Awards or the International Landscape Photography of the Year Awards, or the BBC Wildlife Awards, whatever, they have huge volumes of entries, and they're digitally based. They usually have a number of judges. Whether they divide those images between judges, or if all the judges see all the images, generally they're not going to get a long time to look at your image. In fact, seconds is probably as long as the initial cull for each image is going to be. So it is really important that your image has some sort of hook, some sort of immediate impact. People talk about images that are, that have got that wow factor, and I really think that if it doesn't have that wow factor in some of these big competitions, it's just not going to get a look in. There are other images that you get that are sort of I don't know what's the best way to describe it, sort of like a slow burn, where the more you look at an image, the better it gets, and the more you see and the more you can interpret. And I think those images are great, and they suit a judging process where there's some more time and maybe some discussion, and maybe one judge being able to talk to the other judges and say, hey, look, did you guys see this in this image? And then that often will get the judges in. But with the big competitions, that slow entry is just not going to happen. It's got to have something immediate, and if it doesn't, it'll just get cast aside. It doesn't matter if it took you 3 days to hike to that location. It doesn't matter that it might be a very rare animal that you've spent 6 weeks waiting in a hide in the snow to appear. If the actual image doesn't have that initial visual impact, then unfortunately it's not going to do very well in most cases.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I don't know what you say about referring to you not having experience, because I think you only really enter one competition. You get shortlisted every year in the same competition, so I think
there you go, Nick.
Oh, I know the formula now.
So that's not a bad effort at all. I certainly think, yeah, you have to really go for impact. I have judged some of the online competitions myself, and including the AusGeo Nature Photographer of the Year competition. And yeah, just based on the volume of entries alone, it really isn't possible to spend a great degree of time on every single image. And you know, to be honest, sometimes when an image comes up, you can tell pretty quickly that it probably isn't worth all that much time. And unfortunately, that's probably doing a great disservice to the photographer. But based on the volume, it's just not practical. Like say, AusGeo, you're flying into Adelaide to do it in person, and so you're having to go through thousands of images together, all judges at the one time. And that process is, yeah. So that's one of the unfortunate realities of these kinds of things, and something where the APRA Awards is actually quite good in the sense that everybody probably gets their time, the deserved time. So it's something to think about from that perspective. But yeah, definitely you need something that's eye-catching or different. So it doesn't necessarily have to be immediately eye-catching as long as it's something that maybe people haven't seen before. I guess that still makes it eye-catching in that respect. But that's kind of something that stops people in their tracks and wants to really delve into it and see something, see a bit more detail and understand what's going on in the scene will make a massive difference. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of, I always think something simple is always going to be a bit easier to comprehend in those vital seconds for a judge, rather than if it's a very complicated scene and there's a lot of elements and things going on. It's very hard for a judge to decipher exactly what's happening in that image in that amount of time. And sometimes that might mean that they actually do stop and have more of a look because there's too much to take in a quick look through, but that's probably another aspect. And I think the images that I've entered in competitions that have done the best have been probably the simpler the better in that sense. In fact, generally I have a better hit rate with black and white, probably because of the color not being a great complicator in the setup of the image. So that's another factor to consider as well. But yeah, I think that one of the main things for me is understanding what the competition, like we've said earlier, really favors in terms of the image styles, and going back through your whole catalogue of available images. And some competitions only allow you to enter from the last year, and then other competitions like AusGeo allow, I think it's 5 years. So some are very quite generous in terms of that time frame. And so, yeah, so you have to always keep that in mind as well. Nothing worse than getting a good result and then realizing it was ineligible because of the year that was incorrect. So that's another factor, making sure that the style fits the actual competition itself, or to your best judgment anyway. So I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts on that, Paul.
Yeah, it's part of some people really hate that, and some people really admire it. Basically the reason for it is so people don't get to sit back on some amazing shoot they did once that was as much about the conditions and them, maybe, where they managed to get 25 great photographs in one shoot from 8 years ago, and they can keep pumping them out. So by making the rule every 2 years, the idea is about progression and the continuity and growth and continuing to push yourself and evolve and having to produce different and new work. I know people that are photo illustrators find that really challenging. And I've had 2 partners in the last 10 years that are incredible photo illustrators, and and the competitions are such that every single element that gets put into an image needs to be photographed by them, even if it's a piece of writing, or a cloud from somewhere, or the edge of a chair, or or part of a carrot in case of Angie's case in terms of her rabbit photos. But and so they've already taken those photos and they got them there. The idea is new and the vision is new, and the creativity that you're showing is really progressive, but they have to then go out and reshoot all these same things that they've already done before. But that's kind of the rules. So for the Silver Linings Award, they've actually changed the rules for the first time from 2 years to 5. And that's partly in recognition that everything's sort of gone out the window a bit this year. and they're not running the traditional state awards. So there's going to be a leap year. And so in APA next year, it's going to be a 3-year instead of a 2-year window. But it is an easy thing to get caught out by. And some competitions are totally open as to time. There's a few of them. There's another quite contentious issue, which is how much post-production workers are you allowed to include where you're working with somebody else? So in the professional and creative and commercial world, it's very common that you send your work to a retoucher and you don't do that work yourself. That's actually how the profession works. So there's an argument that in the professional photography awards that should be allowed to some extent, as long as it's under your direction. So it's another way of using the tools at your disposal and within the context of the professional realm that you're in. And that's a bit contentious. And there is now some rules specifically stating that every single aspect of that image needs to be done by you. There's another aspect of a printing awards. What if you get someone else to print your work? You could take a really good file and take it to 3 different people. You'll get 3 different prints. I can almost guarantee you. So how much of that is sort of relative as well. So it's a little bit about personal pride, I think. And, you know, I pulled out a box today when I did a talk at a school on the power of image making, you know, to change the world essentially. And I realized that every single one of those pictures I'd printed myself. And I was like, oh, actually, that's really cool. There's a little bit of a chuff bit of pride there, you know, because that was really hard work and it was a headache. And you know, in my case, I only had enough paper to print 13 photographs, 12 photographs, and I had 13 pieces of paper. So I only had one shot at each one. And that's all I got. And I managed to wing it. But the printing process is an art into itself, and you're not going to learn the art of digital printing in a great hurry. So there's preparing your images for a digital competition, and there's preparing your images for a print competition, which is another kettle of fish. But if we focus on the digital based ones, maybe switch your files into sRGB just to have a look and see if you lose some of the gamut, which you can often do when you go to different color spaces. And I noticed actually at 5:37 today, before 6, that they actually asked for sRGB files, which I've never done before. It's always been Adobe. And I was just like, oh man, I've got some out there gamut colored images here. What's going to happen? And I didn't even have time to look. I just pressed export on sRGB and I don't really know. But there is a difference.
I found that so hard with cyans, hey, like
yeah, cyans especially.
It just kills it when you switch, and it's awful.
And I think, I mean, sharpening's a big part of it. I think finishing your files, I mean, more so for print, but also to some extent with digital, is, you know, that's probably the last thing I tend to do myself in my workflow. Some people use what's called a raw sharpening early on in the process and recommend that. But certainly for myself, that's probably one of the last things I get around to, that finding a little bit of punch. Like the translation to print is different. So you could have a print that looks fairly punchy on your screen with a reasonable amount of saturation, and you go out and print it, and almost guaranteed it's going to lose a percentage of that contrast and lose a percentage of that saturation, or perhaps not even be able to print the gamut that you see on your screen. So that's what I meant. Like it's a bit of a process to organize your workflow so you have really good color management in particular. And I've actually just redid all my screens last week. And, you know, the new screens on, say, your average laptop are really, really high gloss screens and very, very high contrast screens. And they're brilliant for watching movies on, for instance, which is partly why all the manufacturers have started producing these screens. But you'll notice maybe 8 or 10 years ago, if you've got an old Mac, they were these really beautiful soft matte screens. And they had nowhere near the level of contrast. And they were actually a lot closer to what you would be able to see on your screen and then produce as a print. And so now you have to go through these roundabout ways of using software to actually change the contrast level on your screen, or work out the brightness slider to get it close to what's going to be representative. And I learned a lot through a fellow called Les Walkling. And I'd highly recommend that man is probably the preeminent mind in Australia in fine art printing. There'll be a few that might argue with that, but probably not many. So if you're really keen at going down that pathway of getting empowered enough to print your own award-winning level images, it's not so hard just to produce reasonable images, but to getting right up there where you're just doing the nth degree, it's a bit of an investment in time. And Luke and I use, and I'm not sure Nick as well, I think, a local printer here in Hobart who is absolutely amazing. And I've calibrated my screens to his for years, and I trust him implicitly to be able to reproduce what's on my screen. But it maybe took me 2 or 3 years to get to that point where I could say, hey, I'm away. Here's my files. I'm working on them in New Zealand. Can you print them for me for the awards? And I know they're going to come out just as on my screen. I've gone around in circles a little bit, but I think I'm covering a few points.
Luke, what are some of the mistakes that people make when they're entering competitions, like basic stuff that immediately throws them out the window, apart from
yeah, I mean, it's there's a whole bunch of stuff. I have a huge thing for dust spots. So that's kind of like, if I see a dust spot, that's I don't know, it's just been a nitpicky thing of mine for a long time. Watermarks, you'll still see images entered with watermarks, which is you just can't judge that because it's it's giving away who the photographer was, and that's not a good idea. Poor white balance, you see a lot, where there's very clearly, I mean, if they just tapped the auto white balance tool, they probably would have got a better white balance than whatever one was selected. I see that especially with astro shots, where there's quite often a very purple cast to images and that kind of thing. I think there's also, your horizon lines, and then you're getting into more like just crushed blacks where they're just there's just way too much contrast and lack of detail, or soft images where the subject is actually not sharp enough, and especially for competitions where they're looking to print these images. It's very important, obviously, that it's sharp enough to look good in the exhibition. And then you've also got things just like the general composition. That's probably when it's starting to not be a throw out straight away. And you have to also look at sometimes if something doesn't make sense. So if the sky reflection isn't right, then that there's obviously been a composite that's been done, which may be okay with the rules, but then it has to also make sense from a physical perspective as well, at least from depending on the rules of the competition, of course. But there's those sort of technical areas that you can pick up that can be a problem as well. Don't know if I can think of too many other things there just off the top of my head. But that's sort of some of the more areas that sort of I see mostly.
Well, the other side of that is what actually takes an image up to the next level. What makes it stand out? What helps it rise to the cream of the top? And that's another sort of conversation. And you actually get given as a judge depending on what competition. So this is why I sort of, I didn't rubbish, but I kind of was a little bit like, where are these competitions coming out of the woodwork that are just, have the one prize and you can take all your money. But the really well organized competitions, say in particular the APAs and the New Zealand Awards and the WPPI, they have hugely refined training and judging systems where they have very, very long lists of criteria about what to look for, and how to describe it and how to verbalize it and how to look for it and why it's significant. And sometimes we have days of training with really high-end people, and we go through decades of work and past winning images and even images back into the 20s and 30s that are purely in camera craft to remind us about the base building blocks of what makes up a really elegant, beautiful, powerful, innovative, progressive, impactful image. And a lot of the competitions that are out there, they don't have that at all. They're just like, oh, can you just give me your top 10? And that's all you get told. And they don't necessarily give you any criteria at all. So depending on where you're at, and you won't necessarily know that either way, you just have to trust in the faith of the level of consistency. But I don't think there's any award system that's more under scrutiny than these ones. And believe me, they get scrutinized to the millionth degree every year. And they evolve their category descriptions every year and what they include to try and adapt and keep up to date with what's relevant in the current professional community, for instance. So I guess some of the things that we get told to look for instance, are originality. And so we're actually told, and we're given lists of competitions and books and things to go look at regularly, so we can actually then get a sense of, well, wait a minute, that there was 6 of those last year and 10 of those the year before. So you're not just
Like
going, oh my
aerials.
God, that's amazing. When actually there's a concept or an idea that you know, like I remember one year I did an amazing picture. Well, I didn't think it was that amazing, but it got a gold, and it was of a power line and in the mist. And the next year I saw 12 of them at the awards, because it was up on the golds wall for 3 days and people were looking at it going, oh my God. And I'm like, well, all right, that's interesting, you know, and I can't assume that was anything to do with me, but at the same time, the point is we're actually meant to be actively looking out there, and we're not just told to look at photographs, we're told to look at art competitions and go to different, you know, painting exhibitions and understanding light and concepts and narrative and storytelling visually from other genres, so we can actually maybe see when somebody's paying homage to a certain artist or a certain idea and come before. Or we can be more aware of where maybe plagiarism's coming in, where people are literally copying other ideas. And it's a fine line between flattery and plagiarism, you know, and you are allowed to pay homage to ideas and people to some extent. And some people will say everything's in photography has already been done. And that's probably a reasonably valid argument to some extent. But originality, innovation, emotional impact, as much as anything else, narrative and storytelling. I think often when I see an image being challenged, and this is a process that doesn't happen in a lot of the online awards, but it does in the print ones, is you'll actually have this thing come up where, to give you an example, if one judge scores it gold and everyone else is sitting on 75 or 82 or 81, then it's what's called an automatic challenge. If one judge feels so strongly about a print that they think it should be one of those highest awarding images ever in that category for that year, then basically they decide they deserve the right to at least speak about why. And maybe, and so then there's this conversation that goes ahead where you have to list the arguments for, and you have to be very convincing, not just like, oh, I love this image, it's amazing, you know, that you get thrown out the door if you just talk like that. You actually have to underpin why and list all the reasons and create a very convincing argument, almost like a lawyer in a way. And then all those other judges in a row have the idea to rebut that and go, actually, I don't agree with you. Look at this mistake, or that hasn't been done properly, or it's not sharp over here, or they really should have cropped that out because it's quite distracting, or the highlights are blown out in this corner, or you know, they haven't looked, this isn't really printed on the most flattering paper for that type of image. I should have tried maybe this paper. And that then bounces around in a conversation until everybody then rescores. And you're totally allowed to change your score by whatever you deem necessary. And I personally think that's quite an amazing process, and that's where I've learnt probably the most. And that's where I think a lot of the audience learns the most as well, because there's a huge conversation about all the different building blocks and elements that make up an award-winning image. I think, you know, it's an age-old saying, simplicity is key and less is more. But I mean, we are all going to spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out how to simplify our images. It's just like that. You go walk into that forest behind Nick and try and simplify your image. Good freaking luck. So, you know, it's a concept. I think simplicity is about having a clear subject and creating a sense of focus and order in an otherwise, you know, potentially chaotic environment. And that might be through design, that might be through zooming in close, that might be through physical proximity, that might be through the simplification of the color palette, that might be how well you've dodged and burned the image to clarify what your key subject is with the lighting. It might be how well the leading lines lead in and give you a visual journey to make it very clear that this is a very deliberately created image and not just like a fluke. Images that somehow imbue some of the thought process of the photographer themselves, and you can kind of get a sense of that as much as just the image. Some images are a lucky capture that, you know, anyone could get on the day, and others are like, wow, this person has put a huge amount of thought and engagement to building up their understanding of this subject matter to the point where they've really picked it at the absolute perfect moment, whether it's weather conditions at a landscape or seasonal time of year or a specific event where they've pre-visualized where to be to catch that moment, knowing it's only going to be a split second, and knowing ahead of time where to be. There's lots of sort of elements, but that's, emotion, narrative, composition. A narrative is something that you might not, it doesn't have to have a narrative to be a highly award-winning image, but a lot of those arguments where images move up to gold are ones that do tell a story, that they touch people somewhere inside, that they go beyond the literal, maybe to the figurative or the imaginative, or they have elements in there you can read further into. They have other dots you can join where you could maybe interpret it on a few different levels. And they're often the kind of images in the APA environment in particular that I see moving up the scale, because they've just got something extra. It's something
I
beyond
find
the
sometimes
obvious.
that area sort of creates a bit of a clash for me in a way, where you see an image entered and the judge feedback might be it just needs that little bit of extra thing, and so someone's tempted to go back and insert a little person standing somewhere, or having to do these other little bits and pieces to find that little nugget, or what's the word, Easter egg, that the judge can find later on. And I sort of think that if you're having to construct an image to elicit that kind of reaction, for me personally, I don't really just it's not a thing that I subscribe to. But
well, that's assuming I'm talking about a constructed image, and I'm not necessarily talking about a constructed image. It's like,
that's true. It's
like you might find a little person in the corner that you didn't see that all of a sudden creates this incredible sense of scale and courageousness that they're even out there that you never saw at first. That could be an example of that.
There's one particular image that I know that happened with, that was encouraged from the state awards to revisit and re-enter for the APAs. And I won't mention whose it was or what it was, but it actually it was definitely mentioned by the judges, and it was something that APA is really good for in providing that. It just needs that little bit extra. So APA is great in that sense, where you get that feedback, but most of the competitions don't have that feedback. But I am wondering if we talked about the wow factor in these digital competitions, where you've got 5,000 images, it's got to be culled down to a short list of 100 and then to the winners. That wow factor has to be there to some degree, or that hook has to be there to some degree at the start. But and Luke, you've got experience with this. When you get down to a short list and you're looking at who becomes the winner or the cream of the crop or whatever, do the judges have this sort of conversation about each of those images now that they've got time? I assume that they talk about why they feel passionately that this one should be the winner, or rather than this one. Do you want to talk about that, Luke?
Oh yeah, I mean, I haven't had an extensive experience with this, and I can't really sort of talk about specific competitions, but certainly, there's often a revisit, obviously, of the shortlist, I suppose, and then discussions, and depending on the competition, sometimes there's an additional judges or different group that actually determines the overall winner. It depends if you're judging a category or if you're judging a whole sort of competition itself, I suppose. So there are different processes there, but certainly you start looking at more detail about the image, whether or not you need to ask for a raw file for verification, whether that's part of the rules or not. Some competitions, you're restricted by the gear that you shoot with. For example, with Sony, there's rules that you can only use Sony equipment, so you have to make sure that everything that's been selected has been captured with the correct equipment. So there are a whole bunch of generally that should be validated on entry, but sometimes things can slip through. So there's all of those additional checks that are done at that point, and you will find that the shortlist will even downsize once those sort of things have been looked at as well. And then, I guess you're looking at really it's putting the images against each other and understanding, which one has, speaks best to the judges. But the part of the process I've always enjoyed is hearing everybody's opinions on these images, and your mind can either be swayed, or you can sway their minds in terms of what you're seeing in a shot. And quite often there'll be an image that I really like, and then I get sort of talked out of that, and yeah, like I said, it can be the other way around. Don't know if I've been very specific with that question, but I guess each competition is very different, and it really does depend on how it's structured that way.
Yeah. To give you an example, if people are curious, on Nick, am I interrupting you? What were you?
Oh, I was just going to say, just you put the link up on our Zoom group chat about the Adam Williams discussion, competition judging that you had with Tom Putt, and I watched that all the way through, and that's like the app I just want to reiterate, it's really worth watching, because it is pitting. It's got a short list now, so Adam's selected a short list of 30 odd images or whatever it was, and then it was basically pitting image against image, and they could be completely different. And listening to you three talk about each of those images and its strengths and weaknesses and stuff is really valuable. So I just wanted to just reiterate that to have a look at that link, and to if you haven't got the link, if you're on YouTube, it's Adam Williams Creative, and it was the competition.
Could you copy those over to the YouTube?
Oh yeah, I'll just put that on YouTube now as well. And I think I hope Adam does more of those, because I actually watched quite a bit of that as well, and
yeah, it was great, really good.
Well, I think what I found personally really interesting about it is Tom and I disagreed a lot.
Yeah.
And that actually is where a lot of the juice and a lot of the thought-provoking aspects of it is we both had very good arguments as to why we were leaning towards one image over the other. And so it gave a lot of insight into the underpinnings of what appeal that particular image had, and not just, and why, which is the most important part, because that's where we learn from. And in the end, like Tom actually persuaded me to the opposite image that I originally chose as a winner because of his argument. And I think that's actually the sign of a really good judge as well, that they can listen and be swayed and recognize when they missed something or didn't connect with something that someone else has. And that's something I absolutely adore. And it was pretty rare, I think, that like I said, we were given free rein. Like, we've got between 30 and 40 seconds to put a score in at APA on a print. So there's, and you're judging a category like illustrative, where you might have a wall of static as an image that might take you a month to figure out what the hell it's trying to communicate, and you've got 30 seconds. So there's a risk in some ways of having the story or the communication of an image being too complex to be able to pick up quickly, and there's also the risk of it being too obvious that you're not asking the judges to do any work. And that's a little bit of a dance depending on the genre that you're sort of going into. But what I love about that chat is there's no time limit. We just gave ourselves whatever time we needed to honor that image and to really get underneath it and make sure that it was given all its due. And you don't often get that opportunity.
You're into the no time limits, Paul. It's not a surprise at all.
Yeah, that's why it's 3.5 hours. Oh no, it was going to be 90 minutes, but once Tom and I
I've actually got a
going.
question for you, Paul. You've done a lot of writing recently, actually, on award-winning images. So if there's anybody around,
I'll be doing some more straight after the show.
Oh, and you still got to go back to it, yeah.
Oh,
so if there's anybody that's been really looking at it in a huge amount of detail, it's actually you. And so I was wondering, I mean, you must have written, what, 20 odd articles by now or something?
I've been writing for 9 months now.
Yeah, and so I was wondering,
we've just actually produced the first one about 12 days ago or 2 weeks ago.
And I was.
There you go.
I do have a question, Paul.
Yeah.
And that is that out of all of the articles and images that you've looked at over that period of time, do you have do you think that there's like maybe 1, 2, or 3 recurring ideas or themes or compositional elements that you just see time and time again as being mentioned?
Yeah, really good question, Luke. Really good question, and I'm still working on that answer. I think one of the points of that book is actually that when you start sort of breaking down some of the more highly awarded images, in this case, it's Ignacio Palacios, which is incredible photography if you haven't heard of him. Spanish guy, he's in my group of Light Collective, and he's probably one of the most prolific traveler landscape photographers in the world, to be honest. I know, because I've seen him in action. It's ridiculous. But when you start breaking down, and I've had to literally spend months and months trying to break down the bare bones and skeletons of every part of every image, and you start getting some consistent elements that are in there, and I'd say the bare bones of any great image is a very well orchestrated composition, where the visual relationship between all the elements is spaced really thoughtfully, where you don't have any elements in an image that are distracting or taking away, where there's an element of simplicity, either through the clarity of the subject or the simplicity of the subject matter itself, or the clear focus or sense of order. Like order out of chaos is probably kind of what photographers do in a lot of ways. We try and pull out elements of a scene that evoke an emotion or tell a story more clearly, or make a message really understandable for people. Color's a beautiful tool to be used, and understanding when colors work complementary and when to use the strength of opposition of color for impact, and being able to massage around tone in an image, and I guess using light as a directional tool. One, by actually knowing where it's going to be coming from, as all landscape photographers have always, it's a big part of what we do, but then also being able to maybe nudge it a little bit just to make it very clear that this is a very orchestrated and designed and purposeful image. And that's often one of the elements that, like, you can see it, like, this just feels like the work of a master. What is that? How do you define that? But there's a sense of, I guess, there's a holistic element to every aspect of a great image being considered. They haven't missed anything. They haven't got everything right except the light. Or they haven't got everything right except the composition. They haven't got everything right except the color. They've got it all right.
It's like almost if you had to subtract marks for something, you're really scratching to try and subtract marks.
We get told off for doing that. I've heard judges do that, saying, can you tell me why this isn't 100? Tell me how to take points off. And we're actually meant to judge the other way around. We're meant to judge from a base point and go up. But it's another thought process that's kind of worthy of considering. So yeah, I'm really proud of those books. It's sort of, oh my God, it's been a hell of a journey, sort of pulling on every damn thing I could possibly imagine in the known universe, in terms of my skill and experience, and bouncing off, Dex and design, and Iggy and his ideas, and Peter Eastway as well as also. So I just chucked a link up to that, actually. There's another book that I'll find the one too that's actually free that I'll send a link to as well, and it was kind of like the preemptor for this one. So if you want to get a taster of maybe it's a book on composition, but it breaks it down into light and color and complementary colors and a lot of the sort of building blocks. So I guess the idea of by going through this book and getting a sense of how each image is broken down into the parts that really work, you can then start bringing each of those pieces away yourself and apply them to your own images. So it's not like, I'm never going to take an image like that. It's, well, actually, I really enjoy the simplicity of that one. Maybe I'll remember that. Or, geez, I didn't really think about that complement of color. Maybe I'll really have that in mind next time I'm in that environment. Or there's such a softness to this image and the way it's been captured. I never thought of, doing exposure that way. Or, so there's a lot of ideas and keywords, and it's broken down into really recognizable sort of sections, and they do become quite consistent. So you sort of, and one of the things that actually talks about is pattern and rhythm. And that's not something that's really obvious to us, but when you look at an image, there's often a pattern and a rhythm to it. And I equate that almost to sound. Is this a loud image? Is it a quiet image? Is it a fast staccato rhythm? Is it a flowing alternating rhythm? And that can be done through shapes and structure, as well as color, as well as contrast. And so there's other aspects you might not have thought about with an image that you might find quite insightful in terms of opening up your eyes and maybe even looking at your own stuff a little bit differently that you've already seen. So yeah, there's probably a lot of other work out there. And to be honest, I haven't looked at much other work because I'm self-taught. But it's been really fun putting this together. So so that link's there, but I'll dig out and I'll find the free one as well, which is a great starter. And I think it's probably the best free ebook I've ever seen in my life. It took about half a year to put together with professional designers. It's actually quite amazing. And that's where the pressures come on me. He's like, it's got to be better than this. It has to be amazing. It has to be whatever. I'm just like, oh, and and 2 months ago, you need to rewrite these 12 articles. I need to be longer. There's more in it. And I'm just like, oh my God. And like the judging, I'm like, all right, I'm on the spot. This is really pushing me, but what's the best I've got? And I'm only going to give my best. And I've learned a lot.
That's good, mate. That's
long answer to a short question.
No, it's all right. I'm pretty used to it.
But it's a big question. It's a big question. What are the consistent
I actually had another come up
Yeah.
with another question for you as well. So I'm inviting trouble, but it's on a different topic. In a well, not a different topic. It was all about competitions, but sort of more looking at we've talked a lot about what works and what doesn't work, and what happens when things go well, I guess. But when you don't get a result you're expecting, and I'm sure that maybe once or twice that's happened to you, Paul. Probably not many times, but
more than I care.
How do you deal with that? Like, what's the it's I think competition's essentially playing a game, and when you don't win the game that you might have been expecting to, it can be quite demoralizing. And how do you bounce back, and what's the sort of mindset that you kind of go with to actually feel like bouncing back and getting back into it again?
Well, that is a really big question, Luke, and it comes up every year for me. I'd say don't ask my partner Angie the answer to that question because she's seen me absolutely crack the willies a few times. And I remember this is a funny one. Like last year, I was judging the landscape awards for APA, and I'd done really well at state. I had 4 gold awards and 5 silver distinctions and 3 silvers, which is probably one of the best tours I've ever done. And I put my 4 golds into APA. And there's this kind of thing that happens often where the awards you get at state aren't necessarily the same as you get at APA. And generally they go down. Is considered, well, this is a national level. It's it's harder. And for the first probably 6 years, I had the opposite, where every single one of my prints went up when it went to APA, every single time, all 4 of them. And everyone's like, what the hell? I don't know why. And my 4 golds, I was literally looking there and I was judging a print passionately up to gold, thinking, right, no one else was there. There was Jackie Rankin was on 77 and someone else on 79. And I'm like, no way, I'm standing up for this. This is incredible. And I quite proudly judged Jackie Rankin from 77 up to gold. And if you don't know Jackie Rankin, look her up. She's one of the most phenomenal photographers in Australasia. But in the meantime, on the second side of the screen, I saw one of my golds come up and get 77. The lowest score I've ever got in my professional career. And that image was judged gold by Tony Hewitt, who I consider probably the best judge in Australia. So it wasn't just like a random newbie that came in and got excited and gave it a gold. It was actually judged gold by one of the best judges in the country. And I was just like, and I was trying to keep my professional hat on in the middle of judging this print up for gold when no one else thought it was a gold, watching my gold get absolutely hammered in the other room. And it was this huge dichotomy in me. And it took a lot to take a deep breath and totally put my personal reflections aside in that moment and be present to the professional. And so I've got a choice after that. I can get pissed off, angry, upset. I can blame the judges. I can call people idiots. I can say you're blind, or I can take a deep breath and say, you know what? What are these guys? What are they saying about this that needs more work? What did I miss? Could I have actually composed that better? Is the lighting as good as it could be? Did I print that on the right paper? Did I sharpen it properly? Is there another way I could shape the narrative in this image a bit more through a bit of dodging and burning and a bit more clever design and the way the light shaped through it? So there's an opportunity there to use that as motivation to become a better photographer and to maybe approach those judges and say, can you tell me why you gave this a 77? Or can you tell me what you think this needs to be moved up to an awards level? And that's the beauty of maybe coming to some of the awards, and particularly going to the critique sessions they have, both online and live, is that you can go up to people and judges and say, how can I improve this? And they will straight away say, try this paper, or maybe change the composition, or crop it in here. Or, and so if you're engaged very early on with the mindset that I'm here to learn and grow, and Luke used the word game, and game has both sides of the coin. You know, oh, you got to be crafty, it's a game. And it's like, well, actually it's fun, it's a game, because you don't really know, you don't have control about how you're going to do.
I think it's it doesn't sound the best, but when I did a lot of thinking about it, I think looking at it as a game kind of makes it a bit more maybe not as serious as some people take it, because at the end of the day, you know, there's a lot of variables, and the outcome, like you were saying, being in that top 20% is anyone's game. So
somebody actually really early on in the piece tonight made a conversation that, you know, their confidence about entering, and that's maybe one of the ways to get over that. Just see it as a bit of a game, or at the very least as an opportunity, as a learning outcome. You're going to learn a hell of a lot more by having a go than you are by sitting in the back room complaining and going, oh, it's all too hard, or I don't really want to try. It's sort of like, you know, you can't fail if you don't try, but at the same time you can't win either. And that's where so much of the growth comes, is when you stuff up and you make mistakes. And sometimes, you know, like that pivot point in my career about that image, that was about the time when I got that 78 that went to 98 that I talked about, that I was getting confident enough to believe in my work. And that didn't happen straight away. And that took quite a few years, and it took quite a few mistakes, and it took a lot of drubbings on the floor, and like, oh God, really? And what could I learn that I thought, no, I'm going to just, you know, I'm going to use this to become a better image maker. And, you know, sometimes it's okay to crack the shits and go out with your mates and have a few beers and say, stuff those guys. And I've done that too, you know. But there's a lot of opportunity in there. There's probably more opportunity there. Getting a pat on the back doesn't really give you much opportunity to grow anywhere. Getting told you're good when you've already got a good image, well, okay, that's nice. How does that make me a better photographer now? But actually having somebody say, hey, look, man, if you're really serious about pursuing this genre or this style of work or this particular style of photograph, you need to start really thinking about this.
Yeah, I think there's a when it comes to entering, I mean, my point of view was that I actually waited quite a few years before I first entered competitions, because you know, you want to make sure in terms of how you're going to get to the next level. I think you're the best way to start out with it. Certainly better to go in prepared like that than putting a whole bunch of images that you worked on and then, you know, wonder why the results weren't quite what you expected. But for me, one of the main reasons I entered was actually initially was just to understand, you know, I heard a lot of people saying that my images were pretty good, but I sort of didn't want to believe what people say, because you know, your mum will say the images are good. I thought entering competitions would be a really good way of obviously getting peer feedback, and if you get a good result there, then you know, that's a nice way of actually getting assessment, if you like. And maybe to some degree that's why I don't see as much value in it anymore, because you know, I don't feel like I need to have that level of feedback anymore. But that's it's always a personal choice. We've had a question, actually. Someone's requested that we show a few of our award-winning prints images.
Luke, you got a few ready to go, mate?
Yeah, I might just share.
Let's make it really quick.
Yeah, no worries, Nick. No worries, Nick.
Yeah, let's not talk too much about them. Let's just get through them. Otherwise, we'll be here all night, and I've got to go to bed. I've got work early in the morning.
Yeah, yes. Me too.
All right, so I'll just share this one here. All right, so can all see that one? This is basically my, I guess my most awarded image from back in 2015, and it's called Brossa Bolt. and basically this one, it won the International Landscape Photograph of the Year. Not the, sometimes people say I won Photographer of the Year, but it's just the photograph only. I didn't. Luke Austin won the portfolio actually that year. And so it also won the Monochrome Awards. It was got a gold in the Pano Awards, and there's another one I'm forgetting, but it's yeah, that doesn't really matter. So I always done a lot of looking at it, and really this image follows the rule of thirds quite well. You've got a third line up the top here, a third line down the bottom here. Then this sort of acts as a third line here with a cloud, and then the lightning acts as another third line. So you've almost got this grid shape, and then you've got the lone tree effect in the center here with some really beautiful light on it, and obviously the very dramatic cloud with the lightning bolt. So it's sort of encapsulating a moment in time, but all of the elements are actually laid out in a way that makes it very easy to take in, I suppose. It was just a very lucky shot in the sense of capturing the lightning, and the positioning of the cloud. I did do that in the rush that I did, but it's just one of those examples where you can get lucky and take a shot, and yeah, and it's done. It did very well at the time in a lot of competitions. So that's probably the main image that I was going to show there, because I think that particular year, yeah, I was certainly very, very well ahead in terms of how much I'd spent on entries versus how much I'd won. So that was quite good. Do you have any there lined up, Paul?
Give me a second. I need to share my screen. Actually, Nick, do you have any fast speak to ones? All right, yeah. I found some. Sorry, it was one of these things where we mentioned that cut your screen off and I'll share mine. Like,
oh yeah, I was just going to mention that's the first one that was shortlisted that I had for the International Landscape. Sorry, the Australian Geographic Nature Photographer
so beautiful
as well. At Twisted Lakes in Cradle Mountain. So I'll pass it over to Paulie.
Here we go. This is not anything specific. It was just a random folder of just a few that I think I had for a talk today at school. But yeah, you can probably see, like, you know, I shoot a lot of different sort of genres. So, but what I tend to put into awards is sort of more abstract, sort of innovative sort of imagery that that isn't resolving on the screen properly. Let me just unplug that, see if it helps. There we go. Oh, there we go. Is that coming up better?
No, it's back to you, mate.
Oh, sorry. All right, I'll try that again. Sorry, I was on the big screen and it wasn't resolving properly. So there we go. Try it again. How's that?
Good.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is like, you know, the first thing you're going to say is, what the hell is that? And I love creating imagery that challenges people to even understand what it is. And to me, that switches off the left brain of going, oh yeah, that's all right, next, to like, well, I have no idea what it is. So then your right brain comes in, your figurative and symbolic brain. Or is that a dragon rising out of the ashes? Is that, if I turn it on the side, is that a buffalo down the bottom? Is this a nebula in space? Is it a pool of chemicals in water? Or what is it kind of saying to me? How is it feeling? What is it about? And you know, I'm sort of challenging people to spend time with it in that regard. And that's probably more the style of imagery that I sort of aim for than the literal. This is an interpretation of well, it's actually a very literal photo. I've hardly done anything to it. But I call it apocalypse. You know, when you've got a competition that has a title or a description, a lot of them don't, but some of them do. Like Head On does, and the APA does. In fact, I just saw an article a few weeks ago, I didn't even know, and they chose one of my images because it had what they said was the best caption of the whole competition, because it described it really well. This to me is like a scene, apocalyptic scene of you know, a mining site that's been left bare and unregenerated. And you know, this is kind of what we may be facing in the future of the world if we don't sort of take responsibility of, you know, using up its resources and spitting them out the other side. This is a really simple sort of bold image, really, which I think has a really strong graphical appeal. It's still got beautiful texture. It's compositionally quite striking. There's little narrative elements in terms of like the sense of scale over here that really, if you look closely, you might not even notice at first. And if they weren't there, it wouldn't be quite the same image. You can actually grab onto these with your brain and give it a sense of scale. And there's a little bit of off-kilter element as well. It's not all perfect symmetry, which I quite like. And there's sort of some organic and inorganic kind of mixture and blending of things, but bold color is a big part of it. I'm just picking random images here. Here's another one where a judge in New Zealand, I think, gave it 81. And I think all the other judges were in gold. And he stopped for a second and looked at it, scratched his head, went up close, and then he argued for it to go up to 96 because all of a sudden he got it, so to speak. This is a very subtle image, but you probably can't see it well on the screen, but the detail and finesse to the micro nanometer in this file is incredible. And there's a translucence that came out in print, and there's this, if you turn it around or look at it in different ways, you can see faces, and you can see owls, and you can see sharks, and and you can almost see this kind of guardian spirit of this landscape. And so there was a lot of ways for people to read into a very, very subtle image. This was an example of, actually, this was that image that got gold and then got 77 at APA. And, it's a challenging image. Some people might not get it or might not be excited by it or might just go, what the? And other people see this metamorphic blend of liquid and solid and flow and movement and shape. And it's actually an open cut coal mine, and it's a straight photograph. It's literally almost a raw shot out of the camera. So, there's these diagonals and there's lines and there's flow and there's gripping texture. And there's this kind of dichotomy between these fluid areas and these other areas. And people see faces and animals and some of the different sort of substructures in there. And I used a really amazing, quite reflective, metallic sort of paper, for instance. Here's one that, has in some ways, what you feel like is a beautiful image or a pretty image isn't necessarily the kind of image that's going to do well at a competition. This has done both. It's actually made it into the top 100 international landscape photographs of the year. And it's also done, not so well at other awards. It's sort of like, depends a little bit on the culture of it, but I love the symbolism of almost like a tree of life. You get that sense of like the arteries of the world running through the energy, and it has a beautiful sense of flow, and it has space, and it has breathing room, and it has beautiful subtle color complements in there. It has a sense of texture. Every part of the image has something kind of you can grip onto and enjoy. There's nothing in there that shouldn't be there. I'll just maybe show one more because we're getting late. This one was actually the one that got second in the head-on awards to the camel, the dead camel. Oh God. And to me, what's intriguing about this image is there's a literal interpretation. There's a really interesting sense of scale and man's impact on the environment that comes through here. There's an invisible kind of implied line and triangle through here. So there's a really strong graphical element. There's a very kind of painterly feel to the way it presents. And some people see this here as like, like a needle piercing the skin of something, and this is the epidermy of the side of a side-on view of a body or something. So there's other kind of ways that people can interpret and kind of enjoy it. That's just a small sort of subsection. But it's
Awesome.
it's here's this one. This is a 78 to 98
Spectra.
I'll finish on that one. So this is taken just down the road from my house during Dark Mofo, where we had this incredible, was it 49 beams, Nick, I think?
Yeah, I think it's 7 by 7, yeah.
Going up to 15 kilometers in the sky. And it took me a long time. It was the very last morning it was on. I hadn't photographed it yet. It was 4:30 in the morning. They were shutting it off at 6. And I was like, I got to shoot something. It was -2 or something. It was horrendous conditions. But there was no one there except me, which I really liked. So I could get people out of the shot. So I got low. I shot wide. I probably spent an hour and a half trying to find a composition I thought was thought-provoking enough. And if you think about it here, it's this really powerful symbol. that can reach out to a lot of people. And this is actually a memoriam for the fallen, you know, the soldiers that have died to give their lives for our freedom. And what I felt like this angle and this created was, and I actually named this image Ascension. And to me, it was quite a spiritual image in a lot of ways. And it was representing like the fallen souls of these soldiers ascending to heaven, essentially, or some aspect of that, through that, you know, converging line, you know, just sort of disappearing off into wherever it goes. And again, that was a kind of image that some people just went, huh? And somebody just went, oh my God. And, you know, that was a bit unpredictable, but I stuck to my guns on that one. Yeah, that'll probably do. I reckon if you want to.
Awesome, mate. Awesome. Thanks for that quick look through there, Paul.
Yeah, you know me. I love the quick stuff, mate.
Yeah, well, I haven't got anything like that.
Oh, it's all right, mate.
It's
all good. I think we've.
Oh, hang on, I have got something.
Hey, you got something?
Hang on. Hold your horses. What do we got here?
No, I'm not. You're not getting away with not seeing it. These are all nature.
Yeah.
These are all nature photos. They're just they've been in the AusGeo finalists for the last 3 years. So they're just nature photos, but it's interesting what the judges actually pick, because you enter more than I normally enter, 5 or 6 images. It's interesting which ones they actually pick. So this is just some ice detail. I'll quickly go to the next one.
Never really your favourite, is it, Nick? It's very rare.
I don't mind this one, but it's
I just meant in terms of the images that the judges pick are quite.
Yeah. No, they're often not your favourite, and I've got a good example coming up. But just another nature photo that Luke copied when he was up there after he saw mine. No, same day actually, different year this was entered, and there's another finalist. Botanical, Fagus, just a bit different. I think the visual impact of this has probably helped it through. But this one got runner-up landscape category last year, and I don't know why. And I only entered it because it was really popular on my Facebook and Instagram. People loved it. I don't love it. I like it, but I don't love it. In fact, I'm a bit over it. But it's interesting what people pick, and I think this one has just got it's just original. It's quite a bit different to any normal sort of shot or waterfall shot that people see. So I think that's what got it over the line. But I don't quite see what everybody else sees in it. But I did enter it because, in fact, it was a last-minute entry. It was like, oh, I'll throw it in anyway. And yeah, it ended up being runner-up in the landscape category. But I won't rabbit on anymore. I'll stop sharing my screen. But it's interesting. I guess the point is that it's not necessarily what you like. It's what someone else likes. And
it's still quality images, I guess.
Well, you must have had a reason for putting it in the first place, Nick.
Yeah.
I put it in because it was a popular photo with a lot of people, and so I thought I'll put it in because it might do well. It did well, but yeah.
I think it's something probably pretty different. I think the judges would have seen that and thought, it's just a different take, and
Yeah, I think that's what it was. But anyway,
just on that, Nick, like I think, and this is going back to Luke's question on me before, is how do you pull yourself up when your sort of jaw hits the ground? Is oh God, I just totally had a brain fart. You go to the next image, Nick, I'll think of it.
That's it anyway.
What was it? No, blank. I'm finished for dinner.
Oh, good. Look, we need to in this session now anyway. So, Luke, do you want to do that?
Yeah, no worries. Look,
thanks so
much for joining us tonight. So we've, it was really
and
awesome
Louise and Robin, our faithfuls, just hanging in there to the end. Well done, team. We love you.
Thanks for joining us, guys.
And Timothy, good to have you there. Tom, brother.
Next week, the topic's going to be astrophotography, which is a topic very close to my heart. So I'm looking forward to talking about that next week. And so I think that's pretty much it. We'll leave some links in the YouTube caption as well. so that we can, so if you need to follow up anything, we talked about quite a few things tonight, so it's a good way to have a bit of a point of reference for all of that. We'll be the same time next week. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
And
Bye for now.
we'll see you in a few competitions. Give it a go.
Bye.
Bye.